is for entertainment, information and reflection purposes only. It's not a substitute for psychotherapy, medical or professional advice. Full disclaimer is in the blurb below. Okay, let's be honest, we have all met them. The person who can't enter a room without announcing their own greatness. The friend who reminds you for the 10th time that they got a first in college, and that was 20 or 30 years ago. The guy on a first date who somehow manages to compare himself to Elon Musk before the starter arrives, or a neighbour who needs you to know how much they spent on their car, or how rare their wine collection is. And you roll your eyes and you mutter under your breath, but secretly you wonder what on earth is going on in there. Because people who are genuinely secure don't need to inflate like parade balloons. They don't need to stand on ladders to feel tall. And yet the world is absolutely full of self-aggrandizers. They're just puffing themselves up, exaggerating, and as my grandfather used to call them, blowing left, right, and centre. And it's as if the slightest criticism might pierce their skin and leave them feeling flat and deflated on the floor. So yeah, on today's Freud Made Me Do It, this is the case file, self-aggrandizement. This is a defense mechanism where the ego turns on a show, a grandiose show, to try and convince the world and itself that it's bigger, shinier, and more invincible than it actually feels. Now, let me explain. This does not go down very well in rural Irish society where I live in particular. Most people are pretty grounded, self-depreciating, no nonsense. This has a tendency to grate on their nerves. I've watched it unfold in my presence and seen the eye rolls. So this defense mechanism, you see, it's not just annoying, it's revealing. Self-aggrandizement tells us something profound about fragility, shame, and the human need to be seen. It's the individual at work who cannot mention a night out without reminding everybody how connected they are, or how they happen to know the manager, or how the cocktails were practically free because they're such a regular. Or another colleague, perhaps, who starts every sentence with "when I" and ends every story with themselves as the hero. Everybody has met these people, and most of us, if we're honest, have exaggerated a little at some point in our lives. But this is puffing up on another level. It's not just a minute exaggeration. It's not just telling a good story. This is completely different. It's a moment of, oh, did I mention I know so-and-so? Or, oh, did I mention insert 10 different accomplishments? Yeah, I know a guy in politics, actually, and it can be really ridiculous in its obviousness. And yet, it is also painfully human. So self-aggrandizement is the defense mechanism that turns the volume up to 11 on the ego. Because deep down, that particular individual is terrified of not being heard. It's the psychic equivalent of a massive, giant parade balloon. It's all helium and string, and it's floating dramatically down the street, but with nothing solid within it or underneath it. And the slightest pinprick of criticism deflates it into a sad sheet of latex. And here's the kicker. It isn't just annoying, it's unbelievably revealing, because people who are genuinely secure do not need to inflate. They don't need to embellish. They don't need to climb a ladder. The louder the boast, the clearer the signal. Something incredibly fragile is being protected. So this is why I call self-aggrandizement a pufferfish defense. A pufferfish doesn't puff up because it's strong, it puffs up because it's terrified. And that's what's happening when someone cannot stop broadcasting their greatness, their genius, their over-exaggerated, inflated ego. They're scared you won't notice them otherwise. They're scared they'll disappear if they don't announce their existence along with their accomplishments. They're fighting annihilation with adjectives. And if you want to see self-aggrandizement in its purest form, spend 5 minutes on Instagram. Oh my God, not good. Carefully curated images, holiday snaps, humble brags, everything and anything. Nobody ever posts the shit that goes on in everyday, day-to-day life. Guess what? Everybody's life is pretty boring. And then we get a dollop of excitement every now and then. And yeah, okay, variety every weekend when we're not working, if we're lucky and we're not wrecked. But it is not exciting. It's not as exciting as what it's made out to be on Instagram, that's for sure. And really and truly, it's the unnecessary posting. Close-ups of cups of coffee, close-ups of like food. It's a desperate attempt to look important, to be bigger, shinier, more enviable than the raw truth that really exists underneath. So self-aggrandizement wasn't exactly coined by Freud, but he did recognize the impulse instantly. It's the mind saying, I cannot bear to feel small, so I'm going to inflate myself until I feel huge. And if the world believes me along the way, all the better. So let's have a look at the origins and the psychoanalytic roots of this. So while Freud never used this particular term, the way we toss it around today, for him the ego was always scrambling to protect itself from unbearable truths. So when reality threatens to expose fragility, the ego puts on a costume. So one of those costumes is grandeur. Inflate the self until the shame is completely hidden, and then maybe nobody will notice. Anna Freud, in her catalogue of defenses, showed how children develop strategies to survive psychic danger. If you grow up invisible, one strategy is to make yourself louder, brighter, and impossible to miss. If you grow up feeling worthless, another strategy is to inflate until nobody dares question your value. This is the root of self-aggrandizement, a frightened ego armoured in glitter and false gold. Winnicott would have called it the false self. The child who is never mirrored for who they really were begins to perform. If I can't be loved as me, maybe I can be admired as someone else that I've made up. And over time, that performance hardens. The person learns that applause is safer than intimacy, so they chase the applause. Heinz Kohut, when working with narcissism, would see this as the hunger for mirroring, the self that never heard, I see you, I'm proud of you, I love you. And then it becomes an adult who fishes endlessly for recognition. The bragging, the boasting, the puffed up stories, they're all an echo of the child calling out, do you see me now? Do I matter now? Will you validate me now? Please affirm me now. And then there's the wonderful Christopher Bolas, who might frame self-aggrandizement as a way of filling the unthought known, the hollow space left when you are not cherished. The exaggerated self becomes a kind of psychic prosthetic. You invent a larger-than-life version of yourself to carry the weight of the emptiness. So the roots are really clear. Self-aggrandizement is not arrogance in its pure form, it's adaptation. It's the defense of a small self that could not risk exposure. And the tragedy is that the adaptation becomes the prison. Inflate too much and the true self suffocates underneath this horrendous costume. And that's why when you meet someone who cannot stop talking about their achievements, their contacts, their brilliance, you should hear not power but fear. Self-aggrandizement is always a smoke signal, a way of saying, I was not enough back then, so I really have to try so hard to be much more than enough right now. So self-aggrandizement is easy to spot once you keep an eye out. You see it in people all the time. So it's the colleague who hijacks every conversation to retell stories of how they saved so-and-so and this, that, and the other from collapse, conveniently forgetting the 20 other people who pulled all-nighters beside them. It's the dinner guest who somehow manages to bring every conversation back to career or the triathlons that they're running, or I don't know, their marathon time the last time, or their child's genius IQ score. You could be talking about the weather, and suddenly you're hearing about how their cousin is on the board of Met Éireann or something. And then there's the humble brags, the modern art form of self-aggrandizement. I'm just so exhausted from all my speaking engagements. Translation, look how important I am. Or the influencer who films themselves accidentally helping the homeless. Ring light in tow, carefully edited to show maximum virtue and maximum jawline. And of course, the dating version. The guy who talks for an hour straight about his crypto portfolio while you're trying to eat a salad. Or the woman who peppers every sentence with, my ex was a CEO. As if proximity to power confers importance. It doesn't. None of this is connection, it's performance. Ireland has its own flavour of self-aggrandizement. We pretend we don't do it, that we're actually allergic to showing off. But listen closely in the pub and you'll hear it. The inflated golf handicap and sure, I know your man, and insert the name of somebody in Leinster House. The brag delivered with a wink so it passes as banter. Our national skill is disguising self-aggrandizement under humour. The tall tale, the only in Ireland exaggeration. It's minorly charming on the surface, but underneath it's the same defence. Inflate so you can't be dismissed. Globally, though, the culture rewards it. LinkedIn is one long exercise in self-aggrandizement. CVs stretched to breaking point. Achievements polished until they gleam like fake gold. Even ordinary conversations are turning into highlight reels. Social media has so normalized the inflation of the self, it's kind of like the age of narcissism. Look how amazing I am, please don't notice how scared I am. And that's the tragedy, because when everyone is inflating, nobody is connecting. Rooms fill with massive balloons of egos, all bobbing for attention, and nobody is touching the ground. It looks impressive to somebody who hasn't studied psychology for a little while, but eventually the air leaks out and everything deflates, and what's left is loneliness, plain and simple. So here's the truth nobody boasts about at the pub, or preens about on Instagram, or ever wants to admit. Self-aggrandizement is not about arrogance, it's about shame. The inflated ego is this balloon stretched over a pit of shame. The louder the brag, the deeper the wound. Why does this matter? Well, because self-aggrandizement isn't just annoying behavior. It corrodes intimacy. You cannot connect with someone who's presenting a false self, who's constantly broadcasting an edited, censored, or curated version of themselves. You cannot feel close to someone who treats every moment like it's a stage scene in a play. At its core, self-aggrandizement is a shield against annihilation anxiety. The terrified part of the psyche says, I am not impressive, I am nothing. So the ego throws on so much armour plated with stories, credentials, and possessions. Every brag is a plea. Please don't see how small I feel. Please don't notice all the emptiness inside of me. And attachment theory explains the roots of this. So going back to elaborate on what I said before, the child who is unseen or only valued when they performed grows into the adult who must perform endlessly to feel worthy. If mommy and daddy only lit up when you got straight A's, you learn fast that achievement equal love. And now you're 60-something, still performing for a mother who isn't even in the room. So self-aggrandizement is the ghost of that childhood bargain, plain and simple. So if I go back to narcissistic vulnerability and the wonderful Heinz Kahoot, when a self never gets enough mirroring, enough validation, it's endlessly fishing for it. It's really brutal with regard to the irony. The very thing meant to protect the fragile self suffocates it. And in therapy, you see the cycle up close. Someone brags relentlessly about their achievements, their cars, their money, their busy calendar, and underneath there is eventually a digging to the tears about never being enough or rage at never been seen. We get to the shame so deep that they'd rather talk about money than touch it. And that is the core of self-aggrandizement, a fragile self hiding behind a megaphone. But the tragedy is that it really and truly turns people off and drives people away. The very defense designed to secure love sabotages. And friends get tired, partners withdraw, and colleagues run away from the individual. The person's left lonelier than before. And it just confirms their secret fear that without inflation, they're unworthy somehow, which they're not. Nobody is. The other thing about why this matters is self-aggrandizement is contagious in a culture obsessed with image. People tend to reward the loudest voices, the flashiest displays, the exaggerated CVs, but underneath relationships crack. Because intimacy requires humility, connection requires vulnerability, love requires reality. You cannot build a life without authenticity and groundedness and trying to remain in your true self. As I said, nobody's that exciting. We're all pretty boring. So, how do you spot this? Listen for the constant eye. Notice the lack of curiosity about other people. Watch for the inflation of minor stories into epics. Feel into the energy. Are you connected to this person or are you being recruited into their fan club? And self-aggrandizement is never about arrogance. I know it looks that way. Remember, it's always about shame. The louder the brag, the deeper the wound. The more inflated the self, the more fragile the core. If you can see that, you stop wasting energy envying or resenting it, and you start recognizing it for what it is, a desperate defense against collapse. So you don't need to inflate to be worthy. You don't need to perform to be loved. The people who matter don't want balloons and hot air. They want all of you, warts and all, faults, failings, good bits, bad bits. We're all a mix of everything. So that's self-aggrandizement. Freud made you do it. Now you can stop it. If you recognize it, journal on it, and just, keep an eye out for it. I'm Annie. Have a really great day.